So today we're going to talk about reconciliation. And in doing that, or in coming up with that topic, I started to reflect on Columbus Day, right? So there are a lot of questions about Columbus Day. Should we be celebrating that? Should we be, um, changing it to something else? There's been talk of recognizing the Native Americans that were killed because of the importation of European folks into this region. And so I wanted to ask some questions and think about the idea of how do we reconcile things that have happened in the past that are bad, but led to the current future, which I think a lot of us, the majority, would think are good. And that's a really important thing, I think, for us to realize when it comes to dealing with some of the issues of society today, whether it's how the internet never forgets or how do we reconcile with our own selves. So starting with Columbus Day, is Columbus a villain or a hero? In a lot of people's circles today, you'll hear that it depends basically on what your politics are. If you're a liberal, you'll say he was a villain and he killed indigenous people and enslaved them. On the conservative side, you'll say that he was a hero and he discovered America, and his initiative and determination to find ideally a path around the world, which is what he was aiming for, is something to be emulated. So which is it? Was he the dedicated explorer or the reviled oppressor? When you look at what he accomplished or what the results of his actions were, so he established the Columbian Exchange, which allowed for ideas, plants, agriculture to be exchanged, but also diseases and oppression, enslavement. He was also jailed by Spain for being an abusive governor. I found that in a history.com article. Maybe not the most reputable sources, but probably not the worst either. And he was jailed for abusive governance. For enslaving the people that Spain gave him the grant to be governors over, they actually brought him back in chains. So that's just one example, right? Columbus is one person around which we have spirited debates that probably aren't really based on any sort of productive mindset. It just depends on who we're trying to convince of what. So if we expand that question beyond Columbus to say, was he good or bad? How do we look at the ideas of the white man's burden, which drove much of the colonial expansion of Europe through over the decades and the centuries? The idea that the white man had a burden to bring civilization, quote unquote, to other people. And what about in the US? The idea of manifest destiny, that we are destined by God to rule from sea to shining sea. Because that is the underpinning of why our country looks the way it does in terms of geography. And then even beyond that, if we look at our founding fathers, that's been a topic of discussion recently with the reflection on racial inequality. Founding fathers were mostly slave owners. They ensconced slavery into the Constitution initially. And so we look back at them and were they good people or were they not? Well, it's a little bit of both, right? They had this certain set of idealism that all men are created equal. And granted, that meant a pretty specifically narrow group of folks. And they were looking to build a more perfect nation, right? A more perfect society. So it's not one of those things where you can say they were in one category or another, where you can say, well, according to our times, they were bad. That's probably true. According to our times, they would be bad because they held people in slavery. According to their times, they were probably good and heroes. So how do you take both of those at the same time and then reconcile those ideas? The same thing needs to be asked about the history of slavery and racism and the foundations of America. Without slavery, America wouldn't look like it does. America's wealth and prosperity is built on the bedrock of slavery. That's not to say it's good, because it certainly isn't, but it's kind of our own original sin, if you want to put it in that regard. So what do we do about it? And that to me is really the question. So Columbus is both a villain and a hero, as are our founding fathers, as are the many people who we've elected to be president and in Congress who have made decisions that have enslaved and murdered and displaced millions of people over the centuries. But because we can't change the past, we have to account for it and reconcile it in ourselves and figure out how to be better humans going forward in the future. One of the ways we can do that is at least to learn the history. right? The actual history that happened, the facts, the fact that there were people living here, millions of people before the Europeans arrived. Learn the fact that millions of slaves were ripped out of their families in Africa and brought, and then in the Caribbean as well, and then brought to America to work, and how the history of slavery and racism were the foundation for the country. A really great book that I've read not too long ago was Lies My Teacher Told Me. And it's a really great examination of history books, which sounds terribly boring. But he does a really good job of both looking at what the history books say. And so the author reviewed a variety of different history books that are taught throughout our nation's schools and what they said about our history. And then he also injects actual history from historical articles written by actual professors that are peer reviewed, and often are some of the authors of those history books. But he has an interesting take on what they actually have written for those histories. But reading that book helped to open my eyes about things I didn't know, things many of us didn't know, such as the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, or even the 1985 Philadelphia bombing. Did you know that in 1985, police dropped a satchel of explosives on top of a residential building, basically leveling that building in 1985? Most of us don't know that. A lot of us don't know about the post-Reconstruction revisionism, how this idea that the South was about ideas other than supporting slavery as the basis of their economy was a rewriting of history, which is one thing that I think some today would argue, and I would say in the right particular, are arguing those on the left are trying to do, that they're trying to rewrite history. History is constantly rewritten. It's not something that history is written once and then that's the approved history and then we move forward. History is constantly revised, whether it's scientific history, anthropological history, the history of humans, the history of how we see evolution to have developed. And so history is written by the victor, but it's not fixed. And so that begs the question, if we're rewriting history, does that make us revisionist, or does it make us more informed? Do we have a better understanding of what history looks like if we actually go back to it, as opposed to just accepting it the way it is? Because history is not simply about which facts are approved, but also what gets taught. I know growing up in Michigan, I learned almost nothing of slavery other than the Civil War happened, and there was slavery before it, and there was no slavery after. And then a little bit about the civil rights period. And then, like most areas that are primarily white, like mine was, that was basically it. Civil rights were done, slavery was in the past, everything's good now, we're all equal. But I wasn't taught about redlining, and I wasn't taught about the Tulsa Massacre, and I wasn't taught about the 1985 Philadelphia bombing. And that selection of history changes your perspective. It reinforces or takes advantage of what's called availability bias, right? Within the human psyche, we have a tendency to believe things are true that are available to us. And the more things are available, the more they're reinforced. Whether they're true or not makes us believe that they're true more likely, or more so in those cases. And so we have to learn more about our past to understand our own story. Our story as an individual human beings, is predicated on the past that's come before us. Humans are not just born in a vacuum and they're their own person with no other forces acting on them. The idea of the quote unquote self-made man is a myth, right? You have to at least acknowledge that you would not be in the situation you were if predecessors didn't invent language, hadn't invented clothing, hadn't developed housing, society, laws, education, traffic signs. All of these things are the shoulders of giants who came before us that we stand upon. And so if we don't understand our place in time and in human history, our brains are impoverished to understand what we can achieve and how we want to set the future for our children and for future generations. And so we have to be connected to our past, but we're not beholden to its narratives. I don't have to believe that because I'm a white male, that I have to act like white males in the times of our founding fathers. I could, right? That's a narrative that I could buy into, but it's not necessarily one that I have to. And so instead, what I would ask you all to do, as I've attempted to do myself, is to go back and then reconsider, what is my history? What's the history that, not that I believe, because you don't get to choose, oh, I want to pick my own facts, right? That's not a valuable thing to do, but to say, what things should I be critical about? Where should I apply my skepticism, right? How should I invest my energy to best inform myself, to be better postured, to be effective in the future, at creating a better future for my children in particular? And so, how do we reconcile those historical figures and the narratives from the past with the present? And to me, it's not about all or nothing, right? You don't look back to the time of our founding fathers and say, well, they held slaves, so everything they ever said is garbage and tainted. No, you have to look at things through the lens of that time and then accept that they did things that are bad and reprehensible by today's standards and understand that those things are bad, while also examining the ideas that they were promoting and say, are those ideas still applicable? Is there still some value in them? We don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater because we don't like some of the things they did. When you even go back and look at the philosophers in Greek times, many of them had servants or slaves because that was just part of the time. Does that mean we discount everything Aristotle and Socrates and Plato said because well, they said some bad things, right? This gets to the idea of today with cancel culture, right? Which is known in some areas that's a good thing, believed to be a good thing. In other areas, it's a pejorative. It's a insult to say, oh, you're just trying to cancel things. And I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm not a big fan at all of repressing speech, right? Even if it's terrible speech, it's actually one of the obviously foundations of our country, the First Amendment. And it's been upheld that even hateful speech is protected, right? Not hate speech, which is a specific legal construct, but things that we would find disgusting people are allowed to say those things, and there are reasons for that. So in my mind, we don't simply cancel something because there's an element of it that's tainted. Because if we go down that path and we extrapolate it over time, eventually we all get canceled. Because when we go away from historical figures and look at our own lives, look at your personal history, how many things have you screwed up or misphrased or insulted people because you were uneducated, because you weren't quite as well trained at the delicate social dance that we do in interacting with other humans? I know that in my life, I've done things that I would now find completely terrible. Does that mean I'm a bad person because 5 or 10 or 20 years ago, I said something that is wildly inappropriate? I hope not. I hope that the distance and time from that event has caused me to learn and grow and be a better person. So, in that vein, if we want to give ourselves a little bit of grace and ask others to give us forgiveness for having done something wrong in the past, we also have to look to the past and say, that was a bad thing that that person did, but I can also appreciate the things of value that they brought forward to the future. And to me, this I think is really critical. It's not about choosing sides. It's not about winning or losing an argument. It's about understanding that our current human condition is based on both the evil and the good that were done in the past. And we have to accept that for ourselves, that I am the product of both evil and good. Therefore, I want to make sure that I choose good more often than the people who came before me, because I have a better understanding. I've taken time to study and reconcile those things and say, all right, I understand what they were getting after. Here's where I think they went wrong. And here's where I think they went right. And let's focus more on those things going forward. We don't erase the bad stuff from history. We don't hide it. We hold both things in our hands to say, this was evil and this was good. And this is what we're going to focus on going forward. And we're going to try and account for and fix these things, these evils that often still exist in our society. And I think those things are critically important. And then we do the same for ourselves. And we look at the evil we've done and the good that we've done and try and bring forward more of the good into the future. And then we have to give the grace to other people to allow them to do the same. We can't say you've done a bad thing and you're bad forever. You're therefore branded for all of time. What that does is creates a dangerous precedent where we alienate people and we put them in this corner. And over time, those folks will aggregate the outcasts. And that's not what we need. And having studied extremism and terrorism in my job, I know that those things grow when they're secluded. But when you integrate people into society and you help them become part of the team, part of the group, those pressures of extremism subside because you have an alternative narrative, one of inclusion, one of growth, one of forgiveness. And those ideas are incredibly important to building stable, complex societies like democracies. You have to have the ability to integrate. As soon as we say there's a subset of people who are not part of the community anymore, and I see that among Democrats and Republicans today, that the other side have become the enemy. And if that becomes the perceived truth, and we start acting on those impulses, then we will see extremism rise. And we've already seen in just this week where domestic extremism, domestic violent extremism is on the rise. And so while it might feel good to go out and tell people that they're terrible or deplorable or, whatever the bad name you want to call your sparring partners on Facebook, realize that you're alienating them. You're making them the other. You're putting them in this group where all they do and all they hear is the echo chamber of extremism. So what I would ask you to do is figure out how to reconcile those people, starting with your own family. I know all of us have people who are on, quote unquote, the wrong side of politics, but they're still your family. You still have a history of good with them. How do you focus on that good and bring it forward? This is really critically important in today's age because nothing will ever be forgotten ever again. We will be able to go back in our Facebook, message history and find all the times that someone has wronged us. And we can carry that with us until we die and hold those grudges. Or we can choose to forgive people and reconcile that they've done both good and evil. And that we can choose to focus on the evil and alienate them, or choose to focus on the good and bring them back into the fold. So what I would ask for you today is to take some time to reconcile your own good with your bad. Do the same for your family members, and then get smart on history and figure out how we reconcile and how you specifically reconcile the evil that's been done in the past. How is the past evil that's led to our current prosperity, depending on your social station in life, right? How much of that is due to evil? And what can you do to keep that evil from moving forward? How do you dedicate time, energy, money, whatever it happens to be, to leveling the playing field to make sure that we're not propagating the evil that's come before us, whether through ignorance or willfully? And so I'll end with a quote from Sean Connery from the movie of First Night. I take the good with the bad. I can't love people in slices. So thank you for everyone who's joined today. If you're on the Facebook and you want to join the conversation afterward, please join into the Zoom. I'd be happy to have you. And otherwise, I hope you have a great week and to hear from you again soon.